Formula One is very tough. It used to be a lot harder, no power brakes, no power steering in the past days compared to nowadays. But anyway, it's one of the toughest sports that you can do. People have asked me the same questions for years. They want to know about the 7 World Championships, the 91 Grand Prix victories, the years with Ferrari, the battles with Mika Hakkinen, or what it felt like to race against Ayrton Senna. Those are the moments people remember because they are written in the record books. But every now and then, someone asks a question that makes me stop and think a little longer. Michael, who were the greatest drivers you ever saw? That's not as simple as it sounds. The fastest driver isn't always the greatest. Neither is the one with the most championships. Formula One has always been about much more than numbers. Sometimes greatness is hidden in the way a driver reads a race, handles pressure, lifts an entire team, or earns the respect of everyone sharing the grid. I've been fortunate enough to race through one of the most competitive eras this sport has ever known. I watched legends finish their careers, saw new champions rise, and spent years trying to beat some of the finest drivers Formula One has ever produced. These 5 men all left something with me, not just as competitors, but as people who changed the way I understood racing itself. Let me start with Alain Prost, because before I ever raced against him, I spent years watching him redefine what it meant to win in Formula One. When I arrived in Formula One with Jordan in 1991, Prost was already a 4-time world champion. By then, everyone knew about his championships with McLaren, his battles with Niki Lauda, and of course his legendary rivalry with Ayrton Senna. But what impressed me wasn't the trophies, it was how calm everything seemed whenever he was behind the wheel. While other drivers looked like they were attacking every corner, Prost always appeared to be driving within himself. It almost looked effortless, and that was exactly what made him so dangerous. What made Alain different was never raw speed. He certainly had plenty of that, but speed wasn't his greatest weapon. It was his ability to think several laps ahead. He understood tire wear before most drivers even talked about tire management. He knew when to save fuel, when to protect the brakes, and when to let another driver push too hard. Formula One isn't won by driving every lap at 100%. It's won by knowing which 5 laps actually matter, and nobody mastered that better than Alain Prost. As I grew into my own career with Benetton and later Ferrari, I found myself appreciating his approach more and more. People often described me as aggressive, and I never denied that I drove on instinct. But watching Prost taught me that aggression without patience could become your biggest weakness. He showed that discipline could be just as intimidating as speed. Sometimes the greatest pressure you could put on an opponent was simply refusing to make a mistake. One season that always stands out to me is 1993. After taking a year away from Formula One, Prost returned with Williams. Some people wondered whether he still had enough left to compete against the younger generation led by Ayrton Senna. Instead, he reminded everyone exactly why he was already considered one of the greatest. He won 7 Grand Prix that year and secured his 4th World Championship before retiring on his own terms. It wasn't a comeback built on dramatic overtakes or impossible qualifying laps. It was built on consistency, intelligence, and experience. Watching that season reinforced something I would carry throughout my own career. Talent might earn headlines, but championships are usually built through hundreds of smart decisions made over an entire year. Looking back now, Alain left me with a lesson that reached far beyond racing. Success isn't always about proving you're the fastest person in the room. Sometimes it's about staying calm while everyone else loses control. That quiet confidence became part of what made him so respected throughout the paddock. There have been drivers who thrilled the crowds with breathtaking speed, and there have been champions who won through sheer determination. Alain Prost reminded all of us that thinking clearly under pressure could be just as powerful as either of those qualities. That's why whenever people ask me about the greatest drivers I ever witnessed, his name always comes to mind. Now, this one is different, because Fernando Alonso belonged to a generation that arrived just as mine was reaching its peak. He wasn't someone I watched from afar for years. I watched him grow into the driver who eventually became strong enough to end Ferrari's dominance. I first began paying close attention to Fernando in the early 2000s. Even before he became a world champion, you could see there was something unusual about him. Plenty of young drivers were fearless, plenty were incredibly quick over one lap. Fernando combined those qualities with remarkable maturity. He rarely looked rushed inside the cockpit, whether the track was dry or soaked with rain, whether he started on pole or somewhere in the middle of the field. He always seemed to understand exactly what the race required. What made Fernando so difficult was never just his speed, it was his adaptability. Every weekend presented different conditions, different tire behavior, different strategies, and different challenges. Somehow he always found a way to maximize whatever car he had underneath him. His racecraft stood out immediately. He knew how to position his car, how to defend without wasting time, and how to pressure the driver ahead without forcing unnecessary risks. Those are qualities you only fully appreciate when you're trying to beat someone over an entire championship. The thing I admired most was his confidence. Not arrogance, but genuine belief in his own ability. Formula One can be overwhelming for young drivers. You're surrounded by world champions, massive expectations, and constant scrutiny. Fernando never appeared intimidated by any of it. He drove as though he belonged at the front from the very beginning, and before long, everyone else believed it too. The seasons that define my memories of Fernando are 2005 and 2006. Ferrari had enjoyed years of success, and together we had become accustomed to fighting for championships. But Renault built an outstanding car, and Fernando drove with incredible consistency throughout both campaigns. In 2005, he became the youngest Formula One world champion at the time, ending my run of 5 consecutive titles. 1 year later, he proved it wasn't a coincidence by defending the championship successfully against us again. Losing is never easy for any racing driver, especially when you've spent so many years winning. But there is a difference between being beaten by circumstance and being beaten by excellence. Fernando earned those championships. Looking back now, I think Fernando represented the changing of an era. Formula One never stands still. Every generation believes it has found the highest standard until another driver arrives and raises it again. Watching Fernando reminded me that no matter how successful you've been, someone younger is always working to become even better. That's part of what keeps this sport alive. When people talk about complete racing drivers, Fernando Alonso will always be part of that conversation. He wasn't simply a champion who happened to beat me. He was one of the few drivers who forced me to recognize that Formula One had entered a new chapter, and that's something I will always respect. Looking back now, I have to mention Sebastian Vettel, because he wasn't just another world champion. In many ways, he represented the future of German motorsport after my generation. People often compared us throughout his career, but I never saw him as someone trying to replace me. I saw a young driver creating his own legacy. I first noticed Sebastian long before he became a 4-time world champion. Even as a young driver, there was a confidence about him that stood out. He wasn't trying to impress people with dramatic moves or unnecessary risks. He focused on understanding every part of the car, every detail of the setup, and every conversation with his engineers. That approach reminded me that success in Formula One is built long before the lights go out on Sunday. What made Sebastian different was never just his qualifying speed, although he was one of the quickest drivers I've ever seen over a single lap. It was how completely he worked with his team. He had an incredible ability to explain exactly what the car was doing, giving engineers the information they needed to improve it. Drivers receive the trophies, but championships are won by entire teams, and Sebastian understood that as well as anyone. I also admired how disciplined he remained during Red Bull's years of dominance. Winning one championship is difficult enough. Winning 4 in a row between 2010 and 2013 requires consistency that very few drivers ever achieve. Every season brings new pressure because everyone expects you to fail eventually. Sebastian never stopped preparing, never stopped learning, and never assumed success would simply continue on its own. One moment that convinced the entire paddock came at the 2008 Italian Grand Prix. Driving for Toro Rosso, he took pole position in wet conditions and then won the race against far more experienced teams. Victories like that don't happen by accident. They reveal something special about a driver long before the championship trophies arrive. A couple of years later, he began one of the most dominant runs Formula One has ever seen with Red Bull Racing. Our relationship was always built on mutual respect. During my years with Mercedes, we shared the grid together, but we also represented Germany as teammates in the Race of Champions, winning the Nations Cup several times. Away from Formula One, I came to appreciate not only his talent, but also his character. He remained humble, curious, and deeply respectful of the sport's history, even after achieving everything a driver could dream of. When I think about Sebastian today, I don't just remember another champion. I remember someone who proved that every generation has its own way of reaching greatness. He never tried to become the next Michael Schumacher. He became the first Sebastian Vettel, and that's exactly why he'll always be one of the greatest drivers I've ever witnessed. Here's where things became truly personal for me, because no driver pushed me harder over a longer period than Mika Hakkinen. People often remember our rivalry because of the championships, but for me, it was never just about winning or losing. It was about knowing that every single weekend, if Mika was in the McLaren beside me, there was no room for anything less than my absolute yokest. That kind of rivalry is rare. It forces you to become a better driver, whether you like it or not. What made Mika different was never just his outright speed. Plenty of drivers could produce one incredible lap. Mika could do it when the pressure was at its highest. His qualifying performances were extraordinary. You could spend an entire session finding tiny improvements, only to watch him deliver a lap in the final minutes that seemed impossible. Then, on Sunday, he combined that speed with remarkable consistency. If he got clean air in front, catching him was one of the hardest jobs in Formula One. I also admired something people didn't always notice. Mika stayed remarkably calm. He wasn't the loudest driver in the paddock, and he didn't waste energy trying to play psychological games through the media. He let his driving do the talking. As a competitor, that made him even more dangerous, because you never sensed panic even when the championship was on the line. Our battles during the 1998 and 1999 seasons remain some of the finest racing I've ever experienced. McLaren had built an exceptional car, and Mika drove it brilliantly. He won both world championships, and Ferrari had to improve in every possible area just to stay in the fight. Those seasons changed our team. They forced us to work harder, communicate better, and search for performance in places we hadn't considered before. One moment that perfectly captures Mika's brilliance came at the 2000 Belgian Grand Prix. His overtake on me at Spa, passing both my Ferrari and Ricardo Zonta's bar on the Camel Straight, is still remembered as one of the greatest overtaking moves in Formula One history. I was on the receiving end of it, but I have never had a problem admitting how exceptional it was. Great racing deserves respect even when it costs you victory. Looking back now, I realize Mika gave me something more valuable than another championship battle. He gave me a benchmark. Every time I prepared for a race weekend, I knew exactly how high the standard had to be because he was waiting on the other side of the garage lane. That's why I'll always remember Mika Hakkinen, not simply as a rival, but as one of the very few drivers who made me discover abilities I didn't know I had. And then there was Ayrton Senna. For many people, he's the greatest driver who ever lived. Whether someone agrees with that or not almost doesn't matter, because every driver who raced after him felt his influence in one way or another. I know I certainly did. When I entered Formula One in 1991, Ayrton was already the standard everyone measured themselves against. I had watched him for years before I ever shared the track with him. Like so many young drivers, I admired the intensity he brought to every race weekend. The first time I competed against him, I understood why he commanded so much respect. There was an incredible focus about him. Once the visor came down, nothing else seemed to exist except the next corner. What made Ayrton different was never simply his speed. Plenty of drivers were fast. Ayrton had an ability to drive beyond what most people believed was possible, especially in difficult conditions. His performances in the rain became legendary because he seemed to find grip where no one else could. But what impressed me even more was his commitment. Every qualifying lap, every race start, every championship battle received the same level of intensity. He demanded perfection from himself, and that standard spread through the entire team around him. One of the moments I always remember happened at the 1992 Belgian Grand Prix. During Friday practice, Eric Comas crashed heavily at Blanchimont. Ayrton stopped his own car, ran across the circuit, switched off Comas's engine, and stayed with him until the marshals arrived. That's a side of Ayrton many people didn't always see. Behind the fierce competitor was someone who understood the responsibility drivers had toward one another. In a sport where we all accepted enormous risks that mattered, our time racing against each other was unfortunately very short. We shared the grid during the early years of my career, and our final race together came at Imola in 1994. What happened that weekend changed Formula One forever. Ayrton's loss was far greater than the loss of a world champion. The sport lost one of its defining figures, and every driver on the grid was reminded how fragile this profession truly was. It forced Formula One to look at safety with a seriousness that transformed the sport in the years that followed. When I think about Ayrton today, I don't just remember his championships or his unforgettable qualifying laps. I remember the standard he set for commitment, courage, and absolute dedication to racing. Every generation has a driver who changes the sport forever. For mine, that driver was Ayrton Senna. That's why whenever people ask me about the greatest drivers I've ever witnessed, his name is the first that comes to my mind. As I sit here looking back, I realize that Formula One gave me far more than championships and trophies. Those achievements mean a great deal, and I'm proud of every one of them. But time has a way of changing what matters most. The records belong to history now. Someone will always win more races, break another record, or find a new way to go faster. That's how this sport has always evolved. What stays with me are the people who shared that journey. The drivers who pushed me to my absolute limit, who forced me to improve when I thought I had nothing left to learn, and who reminded me that greatness is never achieved alone. Every championship I won carries a small part of the rivals who challenged me along the way. When you race at more than 300 kilometers an hour, you develop a respect that few people outside this sport can truly understand. We competed fiercely on Sunday, but we also accepted the same risks every time the lights went out. That's why when people ask me who the greatest drivers I've ever seen were, I don't think first about statistics or titles. I think about the men who made Formula One unforgettable for me. And after all these years, those are the memories I'll carry far longer than any trophy sitting on a shelf.